Hello, and welcome back to Off the Deaton Path. I'm your host, Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society, and we welcome you to this podcast for the week of January 2nd, 2025. We are coming to you this week from the Presidential Biography Department here at the Georgia Historical Society on the 15th floor of the Jepson House overlooking beautiful Forsyth Park in downtown Savannah. My very special guest today is author and historian Christopher Cox, who joins me today to talk about his new book on our 28th president, Woodrow Wilson. Christopher Cox is a senior scholar in residence at the University of California, Irvine, a life trustee of the University of Southern California, and chair of the Rhodes Scholarship Selection Committee for Southern California and the Pacific. He holds a BA from the University of Southern California, an MBA from Harvard Business School, a JD from Harvard Law School, where he was an editor of the Harvard Law Review, and an honorary PhD from Northeastern University. During a 23-year Washington career, Chris served as senior associate counsel to President Ronald Reagan from 1986 to 1988, as a member of Congress from California from 1989 to 2005, where he served as chairman of the Homeland Security Committee in the U.S. House of Representatives from 2003 to 2005. He then served as chairman of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, from 2005 to 2009. In addition, he taught federal income tax as a member of the faculty at Harvard Business School. For 10 years, he was a member of the board of directors of the National Endowment for Democracy and of the United States Energy Security Council. Following his retirement from government in 2009, he returned to law practice and currently serves as a director, trustee, and advisor to several for-profit and nonprofit organizations. His recent book, and the one he is here to talk about today, is entitled Woodrow Wilson, The Light Withdrawn, published on November 5th of 2024 by Simon Schuster. It was reviewed in the Wall Street Journal by Barton Swaim on November 8th, and by the one and only George Will in the Washington Post on November 22nd. It was chosen by the Wall Street Journal as one of its best books of 2024. My conversation with Christopher Cox begins now. Christopher Cox, welcome to our podcast.
I'm very happy to join you.
So you have written, at what at first glance is a biography of our 28th president, Woodrow Wilson. And I worked with William McFeely at the University of Georgia many years ago, who was a Pulitzer Prize winning biographer of Ulysses S. Grant. And I asked him one time, I said, could you have written a biography about Robert E. Lee? And he said, no. He said, I could not write a biography about somebody that I don't like. And I've always remembered that. And as I read your book about Woodrow Wilson, which is probably the best thing I've ever read about Woodrow Wilson, I kept thinking to myself, did you come to this biography because you admired Wilson? And if you didn't, how did you spend 14 years in the company of this man?
So it's a great question. And the truth is that I sort of backed into Woodrow Wilson because I had started focusing on a topic I'd long been interested in, how women got the vote, and more importantly, why it took so long. My interest in that subject goes all the way back to the early 1970s when I was a law student. I wrote an article it was the very first thing I wrote for the Harvard Law Review was about the first Supreme Court case that held the 14th Amendment and its equal protection guarantee applied to sex discrimination, what we now call gender discrimination. And the 14th Amendment, of course, is a very significant part of our Constitution. That summer, totally coincidentally, while I was still a law student, I had a long talk with my grandmother that began when I asked her, what was the first presidential election you voted in? We usually didn't talk politics. She was my grandmother. But she was getting on in years, and I was studying law, and I thought, well, these are interesting things. I should ask her about her experience. But she looked at me when I asked her this question, what was the first presidential election you voted in, as if I were just completely obtuse. She said, 1920, obviously that's the first time women could vote. And I was suitably chastened. I immediately realized what a dumb question I'd asked. The 19th Amendment wasn't approved until just a few months before the 1920 election. So obviously she hadn't any earlier opportunity. Uh, Fast forward to the time that I was in Congress, uh, 17 years. 10 of those years, I was in the elected leadership, which meant that almost on a daily basis, I was traipsing back and forth between the floor of the House of Representatives and the Speaker's conference room, which takes you directly across the rotunda of the Capitol, back and forth, multiple times a day. I'm certain that over 10 years, I walked by the statue of the three famous suffragists, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and Susan B. Anthony, thousands of times. And I'm constantly reminded of this. So it kept my interest alive. We actually voted to move that statue up while I was in Congress from the crypt of the Capitol to its current place in the rotunda. Long story hangs on that one. But it was for that reason that I started researching and writing once I was, particularly once I was out of government and had a different focus and was researching and writing. And then I realized that Woodrow Wilson was such a big part of the final act of women's suffrage in the second half of his presidency, but really the first half as well. That he gradually grew larger and larger in the story. And about 3 years before I finished the research and writing, Simon Schuster took an interest in the book, and they saw this as a Wilson biography. So it's an odd Wilson biography. I would say that if you haven't read anything about Woodrow Wilson and don't know anything about him, this should be the second book you read. You should get a standard biography of him that covers all the usual things, World War One, the Clayton Antitrust Act, the creation of the Federal Trade Commission, the first progressive income tax, many of the things that he's so well known for. But this book really does center on women's suffrage.
And it's very interesting because so many of the things you just mentioned are one of the reasons that Wilson is still held in any esteem. I think because he's hailed as being the president who got some of these things that are traditionally called progressive reforms enacted. And his views on women's suffrage, his views on race appear to contradict that progressive tradition, if you will. And yet you've done a real deep dive into both of these, and this was not something Wilson was. He seemed to be even out in front of people that we would consider to be racist or sexist by the early 20th century standards. He was so far out ahead of them. You make the argument that his racial beliefs and his views on the roles of women in society came very early in his life, and he never ever changed his mind on either one of those.
Well, I would say that in appraising Wilson from such a distance of over a century, the first job is to shed all vestiges of presentism. We can't be infected as we look at people who lived such a long time ago by imposing upon them our own experiences, our own mores of the 21st century, and so on. So the job is to place him in his context and to look at what people that were his contemporaries were saying to him, urging him to do, criticizing him for, praising him for, and so on. So that's thing one. The second thing is you mentioned that he had views that he expressed early on in life and then to a certain extent carried through his life. I would say that was more true about his views on race than it was his views on women. He mellowed his view, if you will, that women had no business in public life, which was his earliest opinion, and his opinion, in the early years of his academic tenure. He mellowed that so that by the end he was in favor of white women voting, but he never really came around from his fundamental notion that Black people are inherently inferior and did not deserve not only to be the social equals of white people, but did not deserve to govern. And the idea that Black people would vote and that Black people in the South, in particular, where Jim Crow obtained, might take control, that disturbed him greatly. And that's true of the time that he served in the White House.
After reading your book, I thought to myself, and I've been interested in presidential history for almost all of my life, and I thought, I, I can't think of another president. He had to have been the most stubborn man to ever occupy the White House. Over and over again, you tell stories of people pleading with him to make the case for this, reach out to this senator, reach out to this congressman, send this note. And almost invariably, he either refused or did it in such a way that he really wasn't helpful at all. To go back to my original question, over the years that you worked on this book, did you find yourself in any way more in sympathy with him as a human being, or did you come to, I mean, I can't to use it, to, did you come to loathe him as a person, as I think many of the people who read this might do?
Well, I wrote this book, as I say, centered around the story of how the Susan B. Anthony Amendment finally made it across the finish line, why it took so long, who the heroes were of that story,
Mm-hmm.
as well as who were their foils. Wilson turned out to be a foil. What encouraged me in writing the story was the heroism of other people who, become major characters in the book. And because
Mm-hmm.
they're unknown to a lot of people, I actually went to some great extent to uh, restore photographs of them and include those not only in the book but in the online bonus material for the book, so that
Mm-hmm.
you get an idea of who the real heroes were. So my sense of Woodrow Wilson is that on the metrics that I was using, race and what was then called sex, what we now call gender, uh, he didn't fare very well. But there was much more to the man, and it's hard not to be inspired in some ways by somebody who was as accomplished as he was. He had a lot of demerits that I think were overlooked by hagiographic uh, representations of his life previously, particularly because many of them were written by his supporters,
Mm-hmm.
his political uh, friends who were building the legend. Uh, and this book is much more unromantic, if you will, in assessing Wilson. But you cannot, research a human being for 14 years, read all their intimate correspondence, of the love letters between Woodrow Wilson and his fiancee and first wife, Ellen Axon, and then his later courtship of Edith Galt, not see all the human side of him as well. His father, who I have some complaints about, Joseph Ruggles Wilson, was nonetheless a very inspiring father in many ways, in the way that he encouraged his son, the love that went between parents, mother and father, and Thomas Woodrow Wilson is expressed in ways that I think in the 21st century, parents just don't talk to their kids that way anymore. And it's
Mm-hmm.
really nice to see it, expressed in words and in writing, how much we love you and care about you and all these things. So he's a human being, and he is not an evil human being. He is a complex human being. Looking at him from such a distance, being condemnatory, I think would miss the mark. But surely on the specific metrics of his racial views and the way that he stood in the doorway blocking the Susan B. Anthony Amendment because of those racial views, that's just not a good part of the Wilson story whatsoever.
I've heard it said that Woodrow Wilson, after Thomas Jefferson, is probably one of the most complex individuals to understand who's ever served in the presidency. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, I mean, he has the distinction of having been psychoanalyzed from afar by
Mm-hmm.
Sigmund Freud, who didn't like him at all. Of course, Sigmund
Mm-hmm.
Freud was an Austrian who had some complaints about World War One, so a bit of an axe to grind. But nonetheless, if you read that book and see what Sigmund Freud superimposed on Woodrow Wilson by way of psychoanalysis, he sort
Mm-hmm.
of takes it to the nth degree. I think these days we are very chary about doctors of any kind, attempting to diagnose a patient they've never met.
Hmm.
So we don't put a lot of credence in the medical aspects of what Freud wrote, but the fact that there were so many dimensions of Wilson's personality that could provide fodder for such an analysis, I think is the point. And you're absolutely right. This is a complex human being and a man of many contradictions.
One of the things that you do so well, I'd always known that Wilson was a Presbyterian, and I often thought that kind of explained his rigid worldview. And yet, one of the things that you make clear is that from an early age, he was steeped in what became known as the lost cause, and he fully imbibed a love of the Confederacy. Through his academic writings, he always defended and apologized for slavery and the Confederacy, and he really did hold that worldview through the rest of his life. And as you mentioned, it deeply shaped and I think inhibited his ability to kind of grow as a human being as he went through time. Would you agree with
Yes.
that?
Yes, and most of that was the interior Woodrow Wilson. He was very careful, particularly when he was president, not to say outrageous things in public, whether it be on women's suffrage, a subject he mostly tried to avoid in public, or on segregation. He absolutely did overtly choose to segregate the federal workforce, but it's not something that he went out and talked about like George Wallace. He didn't say, segregation now, segregation forever, and so on, and pound the table or what have you. He was very circumspect. So we know his views about these things mainly from private correspondence, various documentary evidence that he said something in private or what have you, diaries and such. Um, but only when forced to talk about these things in public uh, did he raise them as campaign issues. Occasionally, he would make a speech where he might touch on things. For example, his speech about Robert E. Lee. Uh, but even then, there's more circumspection than there is, hitting the nail on the head and saying, the Civil War was, and yet he did. He said that in that very speech, he said that knowing everything that we know now, he would have chosen still to fight the war. Uh, you know, that's an astonishing thing to say so many decades after the fact,
Hmm.
and yet there he let it slip. But mostly it was the interior Woodrow Wilson that
Yeah.
uh,
But in his academic writings, he was quite clear, right? He hated Reconstruction, right, as most white Southerners did from that period. Who grew up? We should mention he was born in 1856, so he came of age during Reconstruction and the aftermath of the Civil War, and of course his friendship with Thomas Dixon, I think is that his name?
yes,
The
Thomas Dixon,
Thomas
very
Dixon, right? The fame.
influential person in his own right during
Yeah.
Wilson's years.
Yeah, they were very close, and I didn't realize that. We all know, of course, that Wilson publicly viewed "Birth of a Nation" at the White House and praised it as all too true and good history and all of that. But he and Dixon were very close, and as you mentioned, the correspondence between he and individuals like Dixon is very revealing, I think.
Yeah, there has been some pushback, throughout the decades about Wilson's involvement with the movie. Uh, and so I spent a lot of time, actually several years, looking into exactly what went on between Thomas Dixon and Woodrow Wilson. And it turns out that they were actually in touch throughout their adult lives as well as students. But the the people who were, anxious to preserve the positive image of Woodrow Wilson, his political acolytes and so on, who did a lot of the early writing about him, sort of buried the Dixon relationship. They did not mention that the two were corresponding when Wilson was president about who might be members of his cabinet and so on. Instead, they said, well, this was a long ago friend from graduate school. Uh, but Dixon was much more than that to Woodrow Wilson. Uh, They also had contact after the birth of the nation, the birth of a nation screening at the White House. But most importantly, Woodrow Wilson said about that movie after he screened it, and a month or so afterward, when it really became notorious uh, for its racism, and people of all kinds, university presidents and Supreme Court justices and so on are all criticizing the movie. At that point, he decides he needs to run away from it. Uh, but he never says a bad thing about the film. The only thing that he says is, I was unaware of the character of the play. Uh, and that's so disingenuous because it had been a million selling novel beforehand and then a stage play. And the stage play ran at the Liberty Theater in New York while he was at Princeton, president of Princeton, and put 500,000 people in the seats. And it caused riots, and it caused great controversy and elicited condemnation, and none of that could have escaped his attention. The name "Birth of a Nation" was applied right about the time that it screened at the White House, but it had debuted in Los Angeles under the name of the original book and stage play, The Klansman, and it is a romance of the Ku Klux Klan is the subtitle. There's no question what it was about, and everybody in America knew what it was about. So,
Hmm.
so the truth is that he did that very willingly. He did it because uh, he thought that it was actually an important public message to send about Reconstruction, and his book was, of course, quoted on screen. He never complained about that publicly. Uh, Inner titles in the movie, direct quotes from History of the American People. Uh, so
Written by Wilson.
so yeah, that aspect of Woodrow Wilson, I think, needed some correction.
Hmm. You are a lawyer by training. And it seems to me that, and by profession, I think, spent many years doing that. And it seems to me that one of the things that you do so well in your book, it's sort of what you're doing now, is you build up layers of evidence to make your point. You don't hit the reader over the head. You accumulate the evidence slowly across pages and across chapters, so that you sort of lead your jury to an inescapable conclusion when you get there. Two things in particular, as you mentioned, your interest in the suffrage movement. You begin the book with a sort of a broad overview of the suffrage movement, but also the segregation of the federal workforce, which I'm not sure how many people knew had sort of been largely, I guess, desegregated under so many different Republican administrations. And then Wilson comes into the office in 1913, and one of his top priorities, acting on with subordinates or cabinet members, is uh, segregation of the federal workforce. And you describe that very well. Can you talk about that for just a few minutes? Why that was, because it goes along, I think, with his ideas on race and the Confederacy, etc. He was convinced that this was best for all concerned, white and black.
Yes, and it was an outgrowth of the men that he selected for his cabinet because, in the main, they all held the same view. So this came up very early on in his first term. Uh, it was suggested by his selection for Postmaster General, who had been the majority leader of the Democrats in the House of Representatives immediately prior, that we segregate the federal workforce in his department and across the government. His selection for Secretary of the Treasury, who became his son-in-law shortly after when he married his Wilson's daughter in a White House wedding, uh, thought that there might be some obstacles he'd have to overcome at Treasury, but very quickly he was able to implement segregation in the Treasury Department and in all of the offices that Treasury controlled throughout Washington. We now know, thanks to uh, economic research in the 21st century, after NERA uh, went through all of the civil service records from the Wilson administration, that it wasn't just these few departments, it was the entire federal civil service that was effectively segregated during Wilson's administration. And black men who had held high-ranking positions in what was called Taft's Black Cabinet were all uh, deposed, lost their jobs, and those jobs either went away or were not filled with black people. Traditionally, positions such as ambassador to Haiti or the person now treasurer of the United States who signs all the currency, that had been, a black appointee, and Wilson broke those traditions. So just as he had as governor of New Jersey, he just didn't appoint black people to high positions or even keep them in the jobs that they had when he got there. He broke an explicit promise to black civil rights leaders that he had made as a candidate in 1912 when he did so.
Let's back up a minute and talk about Wilson's early years. One of the other things I think you do so well, I mentioned I've always been interested in presidential history, and I always knew the only president who had a PhD was Woodrow Wilson. And you describe how he got it. And I scribbled in the margins fraud, which I did repeatedly in writing about him. Go back for a minute and talk about his educational background, where he went to school as an undergraduate, how he got that PhD, and then we'll move into his academic career, which I think was also influential.
So he started out uh, with private schooling. Uh, he did not attend the public schools, which of course were segregated for white male pupils. Uh, he did not attend these schools in Georgia, but instead went to a what passed for an exclusive private school for boys. The South at this time is, of course, very burdened post Civil War. The economy's a mess. So this is not the lap of luxury by any means. It's not Eton or something, but he had that kind of private tuition. Uh, he then began college at Davidson, and he only lasted a year at Davidson. It did not go well for him for a variety of reasons. Part of it was illness, but in looking at Wilson, and for this, we can look to other Wilson biographies, not just my own research, that concluded that his lifetime of various ailments, seemed to ebb and flow according to his stress level. So when he got stressed out, he also got sick, and that's what happened to him at Davidson. It was a hard year for him. He did not have good grades, particularly. He was worried that other people didn't like him. He came home uh, where his mother said, don't worry, everyone here is very fond of you. They think that you were special. And don't worry that people don't like you. Uh, he took a gap year and then went to the College of New Jersey after that, enrolled at what later became known as Princeton University. Uh, he started over as a freshman uh, and then spent 4 years there. So really 6 years to cover his undergraduate career. And at that, he was not one of the honor men at Princeton as an undergraduate either. I call it Princeton. Really best to parse it because this was the College of New Jersey back then, and its standards were much different. It was thought to be sort of a country club place. Uh, it had always had elite families and their offspring, attending, but it was not particularly rigorous. And yet he was not finishing at the top of his class or near it uh, even then. And even though he had more time to mature because of those 2 years before he went. Uh, he then, after graduating from the College of New Jersey, decides that he wants to be a U.S. Senator. That's his career ambition. And so he enrolls in law school because law school was the path to becoming a politician. He chose the University of Virginia, and he was going to be a senator from Virginia. but then he discovered that he hated studying law. And he put it, very bluntly, I hate this stuff. He said in his correspondence, he
Hmm.
couldn't stomach it. And I had to laugh as someone who went through formal law training myself and practiced law for many years. What he really hated about law school was that it was law, 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 as if they should be teaching music or something else. But he couldn't swallow all the mass of its technicalities, he said. He then went home, perhaps thought better of it because if he wanted to be a senator, he still needed to be a lawyer. So he tried to read law on his own, and then moved back to Georgia, the place of his boyhood, to open a law practice in Atlanta. And that didn't go well. He lasted a year there, had literally no paying clients except for his mother. And so he gave that up. And his father is, getting very tired of paying all of his bills because Woodrow Wilson's getting to be an older young adult now, uh, still no income, and a lot of expense. So reluctantly, his father says, "All right, we'll get you back in school if that's where you want to be," because he decided he liked the ability to, write whatever he wanted and to read whatever he wanted and to have summer vacations and so on. So he's off now to Johns Hopkins. Johns Hopkins, as we touched on, is where he sat next to Thomas Dixon in class, and they became friends because they were at the time both North Carolinians. Um, and Wilson's family was living in North Carolina at the time that he was there, uh, and and Wilson had himself, become a North Carolinian. He was part of a group called the Tar Heels, in fact. So uh, what else happened at Johns Hopkins was, as you mentioned, he was studying for a PhD, uh, but he gave up on that too. In 18 months, he wrote to his fiance, whom he met in Georgia when he was starting his, misfortune of law practice down there. The good thing that came out of that was he met Ellen Axon. Uh, so he's writing to his fiance from Johns Hopkins, and he says, "I have conclusively given up. I will sit for no more examinations. I will do no more reading." And he gave up on his ambition of earning a PhD. I would say that the fact that he eventually was awarded a PhD from Johns Hopkins anyway uh, was not quite fraud. It was instead uh, amazing good fortune. And this is an aspect of Woodrow Wilson that he sort of carries through his whole political career. He was remarkably fortunate in so many ways, in the way that things broke for him. And this was one of them. Two of the professors at Johns Hopkins, Richard T. Ely and Herbert Baxter Adams, thought of him as a favorite. They really liked him. He had written a very slender book called Congressional Government that criticized the U.S. Congress and the workings of its committees, even though he had never visited the Congress. Baltimore isn't that where Johns Hopkins is located, is not that far from Washington, D.C., and yet he'd never been there. He never stepped into the Capitol and did not do so until a year after he published his book. So it's based on no original research. It has something like 40 footnotes, citing to things like periodicals, The Nation, and so on. Uh, and it did not meet the rigorous requirements for a dissertation at Johns Hopkins, which was all focused on empiricism, empirical research, and so on. But he asked for and got dispensation. He said that, I don't do well in examinations, but I need a PhD now, because he was trying to get a teaching job that he couldn't acquire with just his bachelor's degree. And then they gave it to him. They said, come, sit for an oral examination that'll be less than an hour, take a couple written examinations, do it all in the same day. And he got his PhD the next day. So, he benefited from those connections, from the fact that important people at Johns Hopkins wanted to help him, and they did.
Yeah, it's almost the definition of what we would today call white privilege, right? Because you make it a point. of saying, because you're describing this in the chapter where he is applying for a job at Bryn Mawr, right, a woman's college, with this remarkable woman named Carrie Thomas, and you make it a point of detailing exactly what I think she had to do to get a degree, a PhD. What everybody does, right? You take excruciating classes, you go through written and oral examinations of the highest order, you produce something of original research that takes many years. Which, by the way, Wilson said he hated doing research as well. And she, of course, then had to endure anything that women endured as they were going through higher education at that time. And Wilson basically wrote and said, "Hey, I need a PhD." And these two professors gave him one. Um,
Yeah, yeah. So you're mentioning Carrie Thomas,
yes,
who gave
I
him
wanted
his
you to talk
first
about
job.
her. Yeah.
So when he has only a bachelor's degree and he is engaged and he really wants to get married, it turned out to be a 2-year engagement. His wife, a little more, or his fiance at the time, a little more prudent. Things would be nice if her husband had a job. And so he's 28 years old and he finally accepts a job at Bryn Mawr, a women's college. The last thing that he wanted to do, he and Ellen correspond about this. She's worried as much as he is, should you really step down to teaching women and so on. And yet what Carrie Thomas, the dean of Bryn Mawr, had been able to accomplish there was really extraordinary. The high bar that she set for admissions was much higher than had existed at the College of New Jersey, for example. And while he was hanging fire, wondering whether he would get this job at Bryn Mawr, Wilson actually wrote to his fiance, "I don't think I could pass the entrance examination for this school." Nonetheless, he completely disparaged the idea of women's education, that women deserved a college education, that it was even worth teaching women politics and history. He said that at one point he wrote that it was about as profitable, teaching women politics as it would be to lecture to stonemasons on the evolution of fashion. He thought that when he spoke, that his words, went through a vacuum and that it relaxed his mental muscle to teach women, things such as that. So he wanted to get the heck out of Bryn Mawr, and that's when he begged for the PhD from Johns Hopkins and got it. And that put him on his way to returning to the College of New Jersey and landing a spot on the faculty there.
Yeah, you detail his years there as president of Princeton University, squiring donors around campus, and that led him into politics. His one and only office that he held before he became president, which was governor of New Jersey.
Yes, and keep in mind that way back when he was a college senior, he had decided he wanted to be a U.S. senator. So he has wanted in his heart of hearts to be in elected politics his whole life. He got in a fight that lasted for a couple of years with the Princeton Board of Trustees while he was president. And it was very bitter. And he eventually lost the faith of a majority of the Board of Trustees, who included at the time former President Grover Cleveland. It was so humiliating for him to be put in this position. And what they were fighting about was the location of the graduate school. It was the sort of thing that if he weren't so stubborn, he probably would have managed effortlessly. But he insisted on his way and even stepped in front of several donations that would have helped the school to build the graduate school and so on, because they were going to put the school in a place that he didn't like. He had a preferred location for it. A very trivial kind of thing to be arguing about, but it blew up. And so he needed to get away, and he made the leap to elected politics at the invitation of so this is I was talking about how fortunate he was in so many ways, at the invitation of the publisher of his History of the American People, the head of Harper and Brothers. This fellow had thought of Wilson as a potential president even while he was still president of Princeton University. And as it happened, he had a relationship with the New Jersey Democratic Party bosses. And so he presented to Wilson first an opportunity to get the Democratic nomination for Senate from New Jersey. Wilson turned it down because at that time there was not popular election of senators, and the legislature was controlled by Republicans, so it would have been an honor, but he would not have gotten the job. Uh, Instead, he waited until George Harvey, this is the name of the head of Harper Brothers, comes back to him with a different offer. We'll make you governor of New Jersey as a stepping stone to a campaign for president. Wilson says yes to this, and everything breaks his way. This is 1910, and it turns out to be a Democratic year across the country and across New Jersey. The Democrats in New Jersey had fallen to Republicans in repetitive elections because of corruption issues. And this is the progressive era, and progressivism is going to root out corruption. So here's a guy coming out of academia, a blank slate politically. He's never had to take public positions on issues of concern. So he can be the perfect candidate du jour with all the issues du jour. And that's exactly what he then did. There were some rough edges to his transition to being the perfect progressive in 1910 because he had said some things and written some things while he was at Princeton, for example. He disparaged labor unions because labor unions, made it possible for people to do the least work for the most money, and he didn't like the initiative and referendum. Some other things that were, supposed to be progressive articles of faith, but those were not sufficiently damaging, and he didn't have to do much during the campaign. He was advised not to make any speeches. The whole thing lasted 2 months. When he got the Democratic nomination, nobody had really met him, none of the delegates, because the party bosses were able to control those things. And then just like that, he becomes governor of New Jersey and immediately starts running for president. Takes a tour of the West, says he's not a candidate, but he's introducing himself to audiences in all the Western states and to the press, and a lot of it's being reported back east. So he's raising his name ID and his appeal. But it's sort of a long shot because the 1912 Democratic National Convention is all set up to give the nomination to Tammany Hall's favorite, the Speaker of the House, Champ Clark, who enters the convention, having beaten Wilson everywhere that they ran head-to-head in primaries, but also with, a majority of the delegates almost in hand. And on the very early ballots, and for dozens of ballots subsequently, Champ Clark, Speaker of the House, has ample majority. The rules of the Democratic Convention, though, which date back to slavery days, and were meant to give a veto to the slave interests over anybody the Northerners might pick, unless they were satisfied, required a 2/3 vote. And so ultimately, after more than 40 ballots, the convention decides that they need a compromise candidate. And here's Woodrow Wilson, half Southern, half Northern. Northerners think of him as a Northerner. They saw him at Princeton. Southerners know that he's one of them, and they want one of their own. And so he's the ideal compromise candidate, wins the nomination. And then come the general election, another, stroke of great fortune. Wilson has not just one Republican incumbent president running against him on the ballot, but two.
Mm-hmm.
He's got Teddy Roosevelt and Taft, two Republican presidents as his opponents, who together get a majority of the popular vote, and he rides in with 42% of the vote and becomes president. So really a charmed political life.
Mm-hmm. And you make it clear that, Wilson has this reputation through other works of scholarship, through other biographies, through time, and that he's this intellectual, that he's this great reformer. And so you sort of lay all that bare. And of course, we haven't even talked about the fact that The other thing that you make clear, you don't spend a lot of time on this, but you do talk about it, is his relationships outside of his marriage with I think it was Mary Peck. I think when he whom he met on a trip, he took many trips to Bermuda vacations. And so I don't know how much of that, if anything, ever came out in the press about this, but he benefited from the fact that I think it mostly got shut down, right?
Well, and in particular, he benefited from the fact that when presented with an opportunity to exploit this issue, Teddy Roosevelt in 1912, famously said, he said this privately, not publicly, but he said he wasn't going to make an issue of it because even if it were true that Woodrow Wilson was having this illicit affair, uh, nobody would believe it because nobody more than Woodrow Wilson looked so much like an apothecary's clerk, and they couldn't believe he was a Romeo.
Hmm. Yeah. And so it leads up to one of the things you do so well is while you are following Wilson through his career, you are also following the suffrage movement. From the very beginnings, you are following it through these years in the late 19th century and the first decades of the 20th century. The what became the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, which would have introduced women's suffrage into the U.S. Constitution, first introduced, I think, in 1878.
Right.
And so when we get to Wilson's presidency, it becomes a gripping reading because you really describe the women who advocated not only behind the scenes, but the women who confronted Wilson almost on a daily basis with the need to enfranchise women in this country, and particularly the silent sentinels and the way that they were treated, the cruelty that was imposed upon them, and Wilson's indifference to it. Could you talk for just a minute about that?
Yes, yes. So Wilson comes to Washington after being elected president in 1912. It's now time for his inauguration in the spring of 1913. And instead of a great crowd to meet him at the train station when he arrives, the Union Station is empty. Everybody, this is the day before his inauguration, is over on the parade route, the inaugural parade route, for a parade the day before, which is a suffrage parade. And it's an enormity. It's this huge display, gala display with horses and floats and all sorts of thousands of marchers and many more thousands of spectators, all filling the bleachers that were built for Wilson's own inaugural parade. It makes the headlines the following day, not only for its beauty, that depending on when the newspapers went to press, they said it was this beautiful pageant, or if they got the full news, it was a total disaster because mobs set on the women and started, physically assaulting them. Held up the parade from its route for, a long time. And here we've got, the first lady and her daughter, the Tafts, in the bleachers, waiting. Both of them suffragists, by the way, waiting for the parade to come by, and it's a bloody mess in the streets. The police are complicit in it. Congressional hearings follow, and one of the prime witnesses in the congressional hearings is a woman named Alice Paul. Alice Paul and Lucy Burns were, fresh from England, where they had met, and they were involved as graduate students over there in the British suffrage movement with the Pankhurst sisters. Uh, Now they are the young Hotspurs in the largest women's suffrage organization in the U.S., the National American Women's Suffrage Association, uh, dating all the way back to Susan B. Anthony. Uh, and these women uh, then make it a point to meet with Wilson early on in his tenure. Wilson has meetings not only with, and I'm going to, for the rest of this podcast, call the National American Women's Suffrage Association NAWSA, which is what everybody called it then. It's a mouthful otherwise. So NAWSA is the largest suffrage group, but there are other, labor groups and women's groups of various kinds, and they're all coming in to meet with with Woodrow Wilson. Uh, and Wilson keeps turning them down to their one request, which is say something kind about the Susan B. Anthony Amendment in your messages to Congress. He consistently refuses to do this. This goes on really throughout his entire first term. And then when he runs for re-election in 1916, he's this time running against Charles Evans Hughes, who steps down from the Supreme Court, where he had written decisions, striking down segregation and grandfather clauses and so on. He was very much admired by the Black community. He was campaigning in Black churches, but he's also for the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. So he's Wilson's opposite on these two main points. And Wilson has to take a position, and you would think that this might move him, but it did not. He stands foursquare against the Susan B. Anthony Amendment again in the 1916 election. And so after he gets sworn in, when he wins a very, very close election by 3,421 votes in California, he defeats Charles Evans Hughes. So the women come and meet with him again at the beginning of 1917, and he sticks it to them harder than ever and says, no way, we're not doing the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. So they say, all right, we're going to do a perpetual delegation. We've tried all these meetings. We're just going to stand in front of the White House and hold up signs silently. And the signs are going to quote from Wilson's speeches about democracy. And for this, they are soon arrested, put in jail, and treated very, very harshly in jail, far beyond what the bogus charges that they are convicted on, which is sidewalk obstruction. It's just worth noting, some things don't change in Washington, and one of them is there's a big fat sidewalk in front of the White House on Pennsylvania Avenue. So tourists who have been there know that, depending on which year you're talking about, it was either 50 feet or 40 feet of width of sidewalk. And we had one row of women standing flush against the fence. So there's plenty of room for pedestrians to pass by. They were never blocking traffic. What actually happened is that mobs of people, including uniformed sailors and uniformed servicemen, and also people that emptied out from the Treasury building and what we think of these days as the Eisenhower building, on either side of the White House. These people are all, federal workers, and they're taunting the women, and eventually they turn into mobs and they assault the women and so on. And occasionally this blocks traffic. But even when it didn't, even when the women were just, coming out and holding up signs, they would be arrested in the end just for showing up and just for having Wilson's statements on their signs. They then get convicted of sidewalk obstruction, against all evidence. And they get sentences, for example, in Alice Paul's case, of 7 months. And as many people know, she was famously put in a psychiatric ward and, really harshly mistreated. Most of the women who were sent to the Occoquan workhouse were physically beaten up. And this all went on in highly illegal ways. So the women are prevented from being visited by their legal counsel. They're prevented from seeing their doctors. They can't take their own prescription medication. They get no decent food. They're put in solitary confinement. All of this for, alleged misdemeanor sidewalk obstruction. It's a terrible violation of civil liberties. And it's a parallel in some ways for the treatment of peace protesters during World War I is on at this time. And Woodrow Wilson stripped them of their civil liberties and threw them in jail for expressing their First Amendment supported views on whether the war was a good idea.
Yeah, and people like Alice Paul and some of these women went on hunger strikes, and then they were force fed, right, with feeding tubes forced down their throat. Horrific conditions, which you describe.
Yeah, and by the way, force feeding today this is an area where we have to, be mindful of the progress of medical technology. Force feeding today is one thing, and this does go on in prisons, and it's sort of a standard response to hunger strikes. But in Wilson's time, this procedure what could be life-threatening. And it was well known that it could be life-threatening, especially when the patients were not willing. So if you've got a patient that's fighting you, does not want to be force-fed, the idea that you're going to get this fat rubber tube either through their nostrils or down their throat
Mm.
and into their stomach without, ripping up organs and or causing immediate pneumonia from fluids decanting into the lungs and so on. Big risks to health. And, this was well known. The reason that they, or at least one reason, I think, that they got the psychiatrists involved is that it was medically unethical to force feed a patient without his or her consent, unless they had been declared of infirm mind. And so that's what they did
Mhm.
with these suffragists who they wanted to force feed, is they got the psychiatrists to say, well, there must be something wrong with them.
And all of this is going on without the knowledge of the public because George Creel, who working in service to President Wilson in censoring the news during World War I, ostensibly against things like sedition and whatnot, but also just keeping any news that would have been considered critical of Wilson out of the newspapers. And one of the things you make clear indirectly is we've come to rely upon these things. I'm holding up a cell phone to get our news to us in the way that people now on the street can just get news out there, what's considered news video. Newspapers almost had a complete monopoly of news in 1917, 1918. The radio was just in its infancy, really, if it existed at all. And so if you could really get a lockdown on news print, you controlled what people knew and what they didn't know.
Well, that's exactly correct. Newspapers and magazines, print journalism occupied the field. That's where people got their information. And at the time, we did have telegraphs. So the country, all the way out to the West Coast, could get information on the wires and print wire stories that originated in Washington. The Committee on Public Information, which was created by the Wilson administration and by executive order of Woodrow Wilson, ended up, having just legions of journalists pumping out news on a daily basis that was created by the government, which was meant to flood the channels of communication at a time when the Espionage Act, passed contemporaneously with the creation of the CPI, was threatening newspapers with punishments ranging all the way to death for saying unkind things about the government and about the war and so on. So newspaper publishers at this time are being told that they should self-censor, and they're being told this in fairly explicit terms. And at the same time, they're being offered all of this information for free from the government, sent to them, in newspaper form, written with suggested headlines and so on. And if they just reproduce this, their publications will stay in business. They won't get sent to jail, and they can avoid legal liability. It was a very effective means for the government to pretty much take over what people were learning about what was going on in Washington. Ostensibly, this was, for war purposes, but the way it was implemented by George Creel, the head of the Committee on Public Information, any criticism of Woodrow Wilson was dealt with in the same way. So they would go after people who were critical, and they would at the same time, flood the zone with positive press to make up for whatever criticism might be out there. And so the suffragists became known as militants. These are the silent sentinels who are, not speaking a word, standing perfectly still and holding up signs, for the most part, quoting Wilson's speeches. Now, I should say that occasionally they taunted Wilson, and when they did so fairly and factually, for wanting democracy for Europe, but not wanting democracy for half of America. They would say something like that. At one point, they went so far as to say that he was like Kaiser Wilson because he was being autocratic. So it was not always just quoting his speeches, but for the main, that's what it was.
Hmm.
Uh, and yet, uh, in all cases, it was just writing on a sign, not the kind of thing you would normally associate with militant suffragists such as they had in Britain, where they're throwing bricks through the windows and defacing statues in the museums and all that sort of thing. Just absolutely peaceful Gandhi-like protest,
Hmm.
and yet they're painted in the CPI press as if they are these militant, dangerous suffragists who are threatening the life of the president.
And who were unpatriotic, ultimately, right? That's what they were after.
Very
Yeah.
unpatriotic, getting
Hmm.
accused of being German tools, even though they took no position on the war.
Hmm. Got so much to tell and talk about in this book. Real quickly, you make it quite clear that the suffrage amendment, the 19th Amendment, eventually passes in spite of, not because of Woodrow Wilson. He gave it very little aid. He did very little politicking for it. Almost didn't believe in meeting with senators or congressmen face to face. Very imperious attitude. And you said you mentioned this earlier, but I think it's worth coming back to. His primary concern, as was that of Southern senators and Southern congressmen who were all white, all male, was that if this suffrage amendment passed, not only white women, but black women would be allowed to vote. And that had happened, of course, with black men during Reconstruction. They felt like that had been an unmitigated disaster, and that is what they were trying to prevent at all cost.
That is exactly what happened. And it's something that it was really the biggest surprise in my research to discover that even after Woodrow Wilson had publicly spoken to the United States Senate, just very late in the game, uh, in 1919, in favor of the Anthony Amendment, uh, he nonetheless conspired against the true Anthony Amendment, which had been introduced in every Congress since 1878, in a plan to change the actual language of the amendment to take away the prospect of federal enforcement. Uh, the concern, of course, in the South, as you mentioned, they still hated the 15th Amendment, which constitutionally guaranteed black men's right to vote. Uh, During the debate on the Anthony Amendment, uh, many of the senators from southern states stood up and said we should never have the 15th Amendment in the first place. It's a horrible idea. And fortunately, we're not enforcing it because we have our own laws, by which they meant Jim Crow. And so here comes the Anthony Amendment, and it has the very same language in Section 2 that authorizes federal enforcement, same as the 15th Amendment. So that's their reason for voting against it. Uh, Wilson agrees with some of these people on a substitute for the Anthony Amendment, which would take that language out and put in its place preference for state enforcement and putting federal enforcement in the back seat. Only if uh, certain conditions, which, as it turns out, would never be met, uh, transpire, would the federal government have any authority to enforce. Uh, this then, becomes the last minute push in the lame duck Democratic Congress before Republicans take over in 1920. Democrats, for political reasons, are anxious, and Wilson is anxious to do this while they control the Congress so they can take credit for it going into the 1920 election. Because by this point, this is an overwhelmingly popular thing in the country. Uh, and it didn't quite work, but it almost worked. And had it worked, had this gambit succeeded and the watered down Anthony Amendment been put in the Constitution, effectively it would have been a constitutional wave of the hand in favor of Jim Crow. So a bullet dodged there.
I've got several biographies of Woodrow Wilson on my shelves. And after reading your book, I pulled several of them down and just flipped through the table of contents to see if I could see the words women's suffrage or Anthony Amendment or anything like that as being central or integral to a biography of Wilson. And I didn't see it. And this is not to say that, I mean, I did not read Scott Berg's biography. I haven't looked at I own August Heckscher's, even going back to 1991. all of which I noticed that you cited, and I'm sure you read through. But you have given us a new, I think, even those of us who thought we understood Wilson, a new way to look at him, and not a very flattering one, but I think a necessary one. And I want to quote here real quick. Barton Swaim reviewed your book in the Wall Street Journal right after it came out, or on November 8th, and he used these words, and I won't read the whole quote, but he used these words: dishonest, to describe Wilson. Dishonest, pretentious, cruel, humorless, indifferent, third-rate, lazy, and of course racist and sexist. Where are you left, Chris, after all of these years spent studying this man? This is a thoroughly researched, deeply, beautifully written biography. Um, where do you stand on Woodrow Wilson and his place in 21st century America? How should we look back at him? And how do you feel
Well,
about him?
you mentioned that long string of adjectives describing Woodrow Wilson by someone who obviously does not think highly of him. What I've noticed in the reviews of the book is that in addition to being an opportunity to describe Woodrow Wilson, the Light Withdrawn, it's an opportunity for the reviewer to express their own thoughts about Woodrow Wilson. And Wilson is something of a Rorschach test. If you are a progressive, then you admire Woodrow Wilson's progressive achievements. If you are a conservative, you didn't like those in the first place, and now here's more reason to
Hmm.
dislike Woodrow Wilson. Uh, uh, in the book itself, I hope that readers will find a much more nuanced approach because, as you say, I try to let the evidence speak. I try to let Wilson's contemporaries speak. When people close to Woodrow Wilson, at the Democratic National Committee, journalists, people who helped him get elected, are urging him to support women's suffrage, and he won't. That tells us a lot about who Woodrow Wilson was. So, uh, the main reason for this book is what you just pointed out. It's a missing story. The role of Woodrow Wilson in the history of women's suffrage is somehow just excised from the standard Wilson telling, and I found it particularly uh, compelling when Gallup in 2000 at the millennium did a poll, and they asked people what were the most important events of the 20th century. Two-thirds say women gaining the right to vote. It beat out World War One. It beat out a man on the moon. It beat out the collapse of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Only World War II finished ahead. And yet it's missing. This is not just a lacuna. This is a giant gap, a big hole in the Wilson story, and it's damned interesting. So that's what the book is about. And the book, having focused on his views on women's suffrage, which turn out to be very closely connected to his views on race, focuses on the two things that make Wilson look the worst, I would say. And so if you're judging him only on those metrics, then of course you have to be very unimpressed and disappointed. If you're willing to take a step back and look at Wilson in toto, it becomes much more complicated. And even after 14 years of research, I can't quite tell you how I compare, what it means to have created the Federal Trade Commission on the one hand and to have segregated the federal government on the other, or to have given us the first progressive income tax, or to have imprisoned these women and treated them so harshly for exercising their right to protest against the government's actions. It's sort of apples and oranges. It's human rights versus, some, technical achievements in his first term. The League of Nations is in a different category in his leadership in World War One, and that's a whole different way to appraise Wilson. And the book is not about that. But whether Wilson did a great job in bringing the American people into World War One and waging the war as he did, and settling it as he did in Paris, that's what all the other Wilson books are about. And so, like everyone else, I draw my inferences from that. But even then, I still have difficulty comparing it apples to apples with these extreme violations of human rights. So I think the best way, at least for me to sum it up, is to say this is a man of inherent contradictions uh, that are, he's like a Rubik's Cube. There's really tough to reconcile. He's a complicated man, but that's, of course, what makes him so interesting. And without question, he remains consequential.
I was going to say so much of what happened during his two administrations, and this is not true of every president, still has so much direct impact on the American people today. And so many of the issues they all grappled with, we are still grappling with. The proper role of the federal government in our lives and in our economy and in voting. And so it really was, you dealt with so many timely issues, and you did it with a great touch. Two things real quick. He remains the only president buried in the National Cathedral. Which I think at one time everybody thought was going to become the United States' Westminster Abbey, which it didn't do. But he remains there with his wife.
Yes, and it's a sort of fitting ending to the Wilson story because he was the son of a minister. His whole life, in a certain sense, is best understood as Wilson wrestling with moral issues. There's a really nice book called The Moralist that's been written about Woodrow Wilson that
Patricia O'Toole. Mm-hmm.
that Patricia O'Toole wrote just a few years before this book.
Mm-hmm.
When Scott Berg wrote his biography, all of the chapter titles were, biblical and so on. So, thinking, and of course we have, Freud's psychoanalysis that we referred to earlier. Thinking of Wilson through a religious lens is a very popular way to understand the Wilson story and the Wilson tragedy. This is, of course, where he was buried, and he died a very unhappy death.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that it's worth taking a visit to the National Cathedral, not just to see Woodrow Wilson, but to remember that this is where Martin Luther King made his last sermon, standing very close nearby Wilson's tomb. And notwithstanding all of the history that Martin Luther King made himself and was aware of in Wilson's time, he looked at all the segregation and all the unfairness in American life from the perspective of Black Americans, and had an upbeat conclusion about where America was headed. And I think that's the epilogue of the book, by the way,
Mm-hmm.
Or at least the final point.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's sort of my hope too, that when we read things like this that disappoint us, that we can find, as King did, the heroes in the story, and there are many, and they're fun people. And I had, as I say, great enjoyment in learning about them and bringing them to life for readers today.
Which you've done beautifully. It's deeply researched, as I said. It is beautifully written. I think there's an award winner here. The book is entitled Woodrow Wilson: The Light Withdrawn. It's published by Simon & Schuster. The author is Christopher Cox. Chris, thanks so much for coming on our podcast and talking with us today about this complex man.
Well, thank you, Stan. It was really enjoyable and enlightening conversation.
My thanks to Christopher Cox for joining me on this podcast. You can find out more about his book at simonandschuster.com. The hardest working producer and engineer in show business, the producer of this podcast, the czar of our Tallahassee office, as well as the captain of the Off the Beaten Path snowblower racing team, is our very own and indispensable Brendan Cannonball Crellin. All guest accommodations on Off the Beaten Path provided by the Horseshoe Road Inn. Our Off the Beaten Path fact checker is Ella Fino. The director of accounts payable is Bill Schroeder. Our chief accountant is Candace B. Rittenoff. The Off the Beaten Path stock market predictor is Luigi Board. Our director of employee loyalty is Upton Leftus. Our staff layoff specialist is Harry Verdurci, assisted by layoff counselor Oscar LaVista. The staff physicist is momentum. Our Russian chauffeur is pick up and drop off. Our insurance claims liaison is Royal Payne Diaz. Our customer care specialist is Begonia Payne Diaz. Our complaints coordinator is Stella Payne Diaz. The manager of the Off the Beaten Path membership refund program is Wendy Pigs Fly. Our in-house literary critic is Al Ligori. The official Off the Beaten Path holiday decoration specialist is Aretha Holly. The holiday wardrobe consultant, as always, is Don Wienow. Our staff director of Three Stooges Studies is Lee Iappoca. Dr. Todd Gross's personal eBay specialist is Selma Junkoff, and our Off the Beaten Path martini mixer, thank you very much, is Olive Twist. You can find our podcast anywhere you can find podcasts, including now on YouTube and YouTube Music. Be sure to follow, like, and share, please. Be sure and like Off the Beaten Path on Facebook as well. You can also find Off the Beaten Path on the podcast app on your phone, and I would ask you to please leave a review on the Apple Podcast app. That would be most appreciated. You can learn everything about the Georgia Historical Society at georgiahistory.com and the Georgia History Festival at georgiahistoryfestival.org. Please also visit deatonpath.georgiahistory.com and check out dispatches from Off the Beaten Path, my blog, and similar Hail to the Chief podcasts like this one. Stay safe, stay strong. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. As always, thank you for listening.